She was educated, intelligent, capable of speaking several languages, a true artist. She was a singer and a dancer, but she was different, and those who were considered normal exploited her without mercy, displaying her as a freak of nature. She was introduced as the monkey woman, sometimes the ugliest woman in the world, or the bear woman, or simply the indescribable. And so it went, throughout her entire life, and she didn't find peace even after her death. In this video, you will learn more about the life of Julia Pastrana, a woman of extraordinary talent, an exceptional singer and dancer who went down in history as nothing more than a so-called freak of nature. But before we begin, if you're already subscribed, give the video a like if you enjoy it, and leave your comment. That really helps me reach more history lovers. Subscribe and hit the notification bell. Of indigenous origin, Julia Pastrana was born sometime in 1834 in the state of Sinaloa, into a tribe known as the Root Hunters, who lived in western Mexico. The girl had hypertrichosis, also called the werewolf syndrome, a rare condition in which the face and body are completely covered in black, smooth hair. Julia had large ears, a nose, and a pronounced prognathism, along with 2 irregular rows of teeth that gave her face a profile similar to that of an ape. There are several versions of her birth story, and very little is known about her parents. One theory suggests she lived with her mother in a cave until some cowboys passing through the area found them and brought them into town. But that remains only a theory. What is known for certain is that Julia, still a young girl, ended up in the household of the governor of Sinaloa, Pedro Sanchez, around 1838, the residence of the most powerful man in the region at that time. She was about 4 years old. Apparently, Pedro Sanchez's wife grew fond of her, protecting and educating the girl. Over time, she became part of the domestic staff, but it didn't take much effort to teach her. The governor's wife was likely amazed by Julia's intelligence. She quickly learned to read and write and carried out all the household chores with skill and dedication. Julia spoke fluently both the language of her tribe and Spanish, and she also learned English in the governor's home, due to the frequent presence of diplomats and foreign politicians visiting the house. As she grew older, Julia became a very hardworking and skilled person. She loved sewing and embroidery. From a young age, her talent was obvious. She took pride in making her own dresses, well-crafted and beautifully adorned. However, she was not allowed to go outside, and the governor's wife guarded her with extreme care. Whenever guests arrived, Julia would retreat to her room, aware that her unusual appearance attracted too much attention. The hypertrichosis she suffered from, along with bulbous gingivitis, gave her a prominent jaw and enlarged lips, which contributed to her unusual appearance. On top of that, she was very short. Even at her full adult height, she stood only 4 feet 6 inches, 1.37 meters. Because of all this, the lady of the house chose to protect her from being exposed. Still, Julia seemed to live happily in that home. They say that while doing laundry, she would sing loudly and beautifully, her voice surprisingly melodic and moving. She even sang at family gatherings to lighten the mood. At that time, slavery had already been abolished in Mexico in 1854, and when Julia was about 20, she left the governor's home because she wished to return to her tribe. But during her journey, she met an American named Mr. Rates, who convinced her to join him on a tour. However, other versions claim that she was actually sold to a customs administrator named Francisco Sepulveda, according to Mexican historian, writer, and journalist Ireneo Paz. Back then, circuses often presented spectacles known as freak shows, in which people with deformities, real or faked, were exhibited to the public. One infamous example is the Fiji mermaid, a hoax created by sewing the head of a monkey onto the body of a fish, which became a major attraction. These kinds of shows were popular and very profitable. Phineas Taylor Barnum, a pioneer in this type of entertainment, made a fortune from them. He showcased extraordinary characters: the world's smallest man, the fattest man, the bearded lady, and many more. In 2017, actor Hugh Jackman starred in the film The Greatest Showman, which tells the story of Phineas Taylor Barnum. Naturally, other men wanted to copy Barnum's idea and create their own shows. It was in this context that the figure of Francisco Sepulveda emerged. During a visit to the governor's house, where Julia was living, he became fascinated with her in a deeply unsettling way. To him, Julia seemed ideal for the kind of show he had in mind. Apparently, he asked to buy her, and the governor sold Julia as if she were merchandise, despite the fact that slavery had already been abolished. And so, Julia left the relatively safe environment of the governor's home, where she was at least cared for by the governor's wife and had daily structure, and fell into the hands of a man who saw her only as a way to make money. His intention was not to sell her, but to rent her to circuses or entertainment houses. He had no plans to part with her. Now in possession of Julia, Sepulveda began promoting her, seeking out circuses and traveling with her to the United States. There, he connected with a promoter named Theodore Lent. Unlike Sepulveda, Lent knew how to win people over. While Sepulveda barely spoke to Julia and considered her beneath him, Lent approached her kindly and respectfully. He spoke with manners and consideration. Julia felt at ease with him, and Lent was deeply impressed by her talents. The two men began to present her as the monkey woman. They invented a wild, fictional story about Julia's origins, one that caught the public's attention. According to the tale, Julia's mother had been abducted by savage natives and taken to live in a cave with bears and orangutans. There, she was assaulted, and Julia was born, the monstrous result of a union between a human woman and a monkey. Believing this story would sell well, they pitched it to Barnum himself, but he rejected it, saying it was far too grotesque for his audience, especially with so many children attending his shows. At that point, Theodore Lent turned against his partner Sepulveda, who, though he had technically bought Julia, had no legal or binding claim over her. Using his charm and persuasion, Lent convinced Julia to leave with him alone, and she agreed because Lent had always treated her kindly. Sepulveda was furious. The two men argued bitterly. But Sepulveda lost. He had no legal authority over Julia, and Lent threatened to report him to the authorities for illegally purchasing a young woman, which was a serious crime. So Lent kept Julia for himself, and the two began a tour across the United States with a show that became an astonishing success, bringing in large amounts of money. Lent was experienced, and he didn't just display Julia in a cage or behind glass. He took advantage of her artistic talents. She received lessons in singing and dancing, and they arranged performances where Julia would sing and dance on stage, her face always covered by a veil, so audiences could appreciate her voice without seeing her appearance. There was even a number where she rode a small pony on stage. She was undeniably talented, but Lent knew that what drew the most attention was shock value. So in every show, Julia appeared with her face hidden, and at the end of each performance, she would lift the veil, and the audience, previously mesmerized by her voice and grace, would often burst into laughter or gasp in surprise upon seeing her face. They eventually arrived in New York, where the show was a spectacular success. Lent pushed the business as far as he could, even selling tickets for people to visit his own home. Poor Julia had no peace, not even in her private life. Even when she was cooking, something she loved to do, people would stand around watching her, horrified by her appearance. Yet at the same time, they were captivated by her behavior, because Julia was incredibly sociable. With grace and politeness, she would serve tea to her guests and engage them in conversation. She was a cultured young woman who read the newspapers daily. Her home was spotless and well organized, and she always wore an impeccable dress. Lent sold entry only to VIP guests, wealthy men and women from high society who were curious to meet her, but didn't want to see her on stage. She seemed comfortable in that situation, despite the enormous exposure and the mockery of her appearance. Lent treated her well, and she earned her own money from ticket sales. She had left behind her life as a maid in Sinaloa, escaped the hands of the customs administrator who treated her like a circus animal, and now she was in New York, in her own home, interacting directly with high society. The only thing she wasn't allowed to do was go outside, and when they went out together, she always wore a heavy veil so that the mystery wouldn't be revealed, so that people wouldn't see her face and then refuse to pay to watch the show. In 1857, Lent took his star to Europe, and upon arriving in London, Julia became an immediate sensation. The prestigious College of Dentists visited her to study the structure of her jaw, and the Biological Society also came to examine her, as there were rumors that she wasn't fully human, but rather a hybrid species, the result of a union between an orangutan and a woman. The scholars and scientists who examined Julia all agreed she was not a hybrid at all. She was a woman, a normal human being with a skin condition that caused excessive hair growth and a severely enlarged jaw. Nothing more. Charles Darwin himself met her and described her as follows. Julia Pastrana, a Spanish dancer, was an extraordinarily delicate woman, but she had a thick beard and a hairy forehead. She was photographed, and her skin was displayed. But what interests us most is that she had an irregular double row of teeth in both her upper and lower jaws, one row inside the other. Because of the excess teeth, her mouth protruded, and her face had the appearance of a gorilla. But the show had to go on. Julia was once again presented as the Bear Woman, the ugliest woman in the world, or the indescribable. Once again, she caused a sensation and achieved great success. She earned a lot of money, and London's high society, along with British royalty, attended her performances or invited her to private gatherings to meet her. They also traveled to France, where Julia learned to speak French and captivated everyone with her personality. During the performances, many men offered money to dance with her. Some even proposed marriage. They wanted to meet her, spend time with her. Lent began to worry. He realized Julia was not just a freak to be exhibited, and he grew jealous, afraid of losing her. He began speaking to her, telling her that all those men were poor and couldn't afford to take care of her. Then he proposed marriage. But don't be fooled. It's true that he had always treated her well and with respect, but he was never in love with her. Most likely, he never had any real feelings. He saw her only as his golden goose. Still, Julia accepted the proposal and became Mrs. Lent, although she continued performing under the name Julia Pastrana because her name was already widely known and highly marketable. The couple then traveled to Germany, where they ran into legal trouble. Authorities considered the show immoral, arguing that a person with a deformity should not be displayed as a public spectacle. Lent argued that this was not a circus act, but rather a theatrical performance. He had prepared a short play, a comedy, that went something like this. Julia played a young woman with a beautiful voice who sings. A young man hears her and is enchanted by her voice. He falls in love and begins courting her. They talk, she sings, they dance, and spend time together like lovers. But throughout the play, she always wears a veil. In certain moments, when he exits the stage, Julia lifts the veil, provoking loud laughter from the audience. When he returns, she covers herself again. The story continues until they decide to marry. In the final scene, he lifts her veil to kiss the bride, and when he sees her for the first time, he runs away in horror. The play ends in an explosion of laughter from the crowd. They managed to sell out the theater after just 2 or 3 performances. The show was a massive success, but there were undercover police officers in the audience, and they reported the performance to the authorities. Once again, the show was deemed grotesque and offensive, and it was banned. So they left Germany and went to Russia. Once again, Julia won over the public, including members of the royal family. Several countesses from Tsarist Russia visited her at home to speak with her. Some of them played piano while Julia sang. Lent promoted her as a Spanish singer, even though she was Mexican, perhaps thinking it would help sell more tickets. And in 1859, the big news arrived. Julia was expecting a baby. Reports say she was overjoyed, and Lent hoped the child would look just like the mother, so he could display them together and continue profiting from the show. And despite being in the late stages of pregnancy, Julia continued performing without rest the moment of childbirth arrived. Doctors had several concerns. The first was her physical build. Julia was an extraordinarily small woman. She suffered immensely during labor, and the baby was born. It was a little boy, and he had the same condition as his mother, hypertrichosis. He was covered in hair, with thick black hair on his head and fine hair all over his body. However, to assist in the delivery, metal forceps were used, which severely injured the baby, and he died 35 hours later. Julia experienced a serious hemorrhage caused by the birth. Her husband, Lent, continued selling tickets to the show, even knowing that she was dying. And just 5 days later, Julia passed away. The great star was extinguished at only 25 years old. Her husband was devastated, but not because he had lost his wife and child. He was crushed because he had lost his money-making machine. So he decided to profit one last time from Julia. Instead of burying them and giving them a dignified rest, he took the body of his wife and their son to the Anatomical Institute of Moscow and sold them to a doctor who specialized in embalming corpses. He received 500 British pounds on the condition that the doctor could embalm them and do with them whatever he wished. The doctor in turn prepared a special preservation solution and embalmed both bodies, leaving them with an astonishingly lifelike appearance. He then began to publicly exhibit them inside the university itself, under the pretense of a scientific display. Naturally, people paid admission to come and see with their own eyes the naked bodies of the woman and her child, now transformed into museum specimens. When Lent found out, he presented his marriage certificate and demanded the return of his wife and son, claiming that his poor family was being exploited. He reported the doctor to the Russian authorities, who ordered the immediate return of the bodies. But to get them back, Lent had to return the money and also pay for the embalming services. And if you think that he finally gave them the dignified burial they deserved, you're very much mistaken. He ordered a costume similar to the one Julia wore on stage to be made, had a support placed behind her back so she could stand upright, and the baby was also dressed and positioned on a base next to her body. She could no longer sing, no longer dance, no longer be the complete act. But at least people could still come and look at her. So Lent began touring Europe, exhibiting the corpse of his wife and son, charging admission to a show that was now horrifically grotesque, because it was the public display of two corpses. In 1862, just 2 years after Julia's death, Lent returned to England. But the fame had faded, and eventually he rented the mummies to a traveling museum of curiosities. Around that time, Lent met a bearded woman with features similar to Pastrana's. He married her and introduced her to the world as Zenora Pastrana, presented as the sister of Julia Pastrana. Once again, he recovered the mummies, which were still under contract with the owner of the traveling museum. And so the four of them, Lent, Zenora, and the bodies of Julia and her son, set out on a new tour. Zenora and Lent settled in St. Petersburg in 1880, but by then, Theodore Lent began suffering from mental illness and was soon committed to a sanatorium where he died shortly after, insane and penniless. Zenora, now a widow, claimed legal ownership of the mummies and managed to retrieve them. In 1889, the three Pastranas were once again put on display in an anthropological exhibition. But over time, the bodies began to lose their shape and lifelike appearance, and Zenora eventually sold them in 1895 at an auction held during a major circus convention in Vienna. After that, Zenora retired, shaved her beard, and married another man. The bodies disappeared from public view for many years, until they resurfaced in Norway in 1921 as the property of Mr. Lund, who featured them in his Chamber of Horrors. During the German occupation in 1943, an order was issued to destroy the collection, but Mr. Lund managed to convince Nazi authorities that the ape woman would be suitable for the Third Reich's archives. And so, Julia and her son were exhibited in the German-occupied territories. The mummies remained on display until 1970, when protests arose during a visit by an American delegation, and they were finally removed from public view and stored in a warehouse. That warehouse was broken into by criminals in August 1976, and the mummies were dragged and mutilated. The baby's body was completely destroyed, and what remained of it was eaten by rats. Julia's body lost an arm, which the intruders threw in the trash. Fortunately, someone found it and turned it in to the police, who returned the arm to Julia's body. But the desecration didn't stop there. Her body was stolen again in 1979. Eventually, her body was recovered and stored at the Institute of Forensic Medicine in Oslo, where it remained for many years. In 1990, it was officially identified as the body of Julia Pastrana and placed inside a sealed coffin at the Department of Anatomy of the University of Oslo. In 1994, the Norwegian Senate recommended that this woman's remains be buried. However, the Ministry of Science decided to preserve them so that future scientists could continue to study them. Still, accessing her remains required a special permit, granted only to those who could demonstrate a genuine scientific interest. It was only in 2003 that visual artist Laura Anderson Barbata learned about Julia and became deeply moved by her story. At the time, she was working on costume design for the New York premiere of a play titled The True History of the Tragic Life and Triumphant Death of Julia Pastrana, the Ugliest Woman in the World, written by British actor and playwright Sean Prendergast. Laura Anderson was Mexican, and when she discovered that the remains of her fellow countrywoman were stored in a basement at the University of Oslo's Department of Anatomy, she made it her mission to do everything in her power to return Julia to her homeland, Mexico, so she could be properly buried. After years of effort, paperwork, and bureaucracy, in April 2012, the Norwegian University officially agreed to repatriate Julia's body to Mexico. And in February 2013, the remains of Julia Pastrana were removed from that cold storage space to be returned home. In a gesture of respect and human dignity, the country of her birth held a series of official ceremonies, including a funeral mass in her honor. The coffin containing Julia's body, covered in flowers, was finally laid to rest at the municipal cemetery of Sinaloa. Strict security measures were taken to ensure that her body would never again be desecrated. Her grave was sealed with concrete slabs over 1 meter thick. Julia was buried in her homeland, dressed in a traditional Mexican garment with a photograph of her son placed on her chest. And so, 153 years after her death, her remains were finally allowed to rest in peace.